explored in depth the idea of a relationship between two people who would be considered intellectually disabled. But not only have you explored that, you've explored it in a time in history where it would have been almost impossible for people to do that.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, boy, so much to talk about. Well, my experience with my sister ultimately blossomed into my experience with thousands of people with intellectual and other kinds of disabilities. But first, I will talk about the fact that my sister has a boyfriend. My sister's boyfriend also has an intellectual disability. We're white, he's African American. So a cross-racial romantic relationship between two people who have disabilities has been a part of my life since 1989. So in addition to understanding how my sister's heart and mind and spirit work, I understand her boyfriend Jesse. And I also know something about his background, which is quite different from my sister's. So I've been inside not only the mind and life of my sister, but a relationship, a loving relationship. So I think that's given me a much more open perspective than a lot of people have. But then when I wrote Riding the Bus with My Sister, which came out 9 years ago, I started getting asked to do public speaking around the country. And in the course of doing that, this wonderful thing happened. Because it's a memoir, people who read it felt they already knew who I was, and so they would come up to me after my talks and when I'd be signing books, and they would share their stories with me. And sometimes their stories were full of grief, and sometimes there were stories of triumph, and sometimes there were stories of struggle, but they always had love at the core of them all. So I'm really pleased that you brought that up right at the beginning. And some of these were people with disabilities, some of these were family members, some of these were professionals. So it was really the whole range. And over the course of just years of being immersed in that, I just started to feel these are the kinds of stories that really need to be told. And the stories of, I don't even know how to put it because I'm so on the other side of it, but cliched characters doing cliched things at best. I don't want to have any part of that. I would like to show the truth, which is real people who feel deep love and deep loss and deep longing and who want the same thing that everybody wants. They want to live with dignity and respect, and they want to live in freedom.
The main character in this story lives most of her life without support from her family.
Right.
And you've made a really interesting comment about a society, I think, because you're showing a situation in which she relies on the community around her, just people. And Homan, the other character, the other main character, also does that in his own way when he escapes. And he's all over the country and he meets all these different people. And it's interesting because while there are people out to do other people harm in the story, there are also many, many other people out there to help without knowing anything about these the backgrounds or the circumstances of the two main characters. Now, what are you saying exactly about society? I mean, I think that, you know, if anything, you know, you're making a comment that, you know, actually, while some horrible things have happened in history and people sometimes do awful things, actually most people are pretty all right.
Yeah, I think that's true. Not to quote Anne Frank, but I think
Yeah.
that really most people are good at heart. And you know, you do see people, you know, when I'm with my sister and her boyfriend, you know, there's the disability issue and the cross-racial relationship issue. And they live in a city where sometimes people don't stifle their more vulgar thoughts. So sometimes people will say cruel things or stare, or, you know, react in certain ways. And this is something, my sister's only 11 months younger than I am, so all my life I have been very much a part of the staring, mocking experience. On the other hand, every time I'm with her, I'm completely aware that that is a small fraction of what happens. And much more of what happens is she goes to the store and somebody who rides the bus with her says, "Hi, Beth, how are you?" and talks with her and is happy to see her. Or Beth will run across the supermarket, grab the woman who works in the bakery, bring her out to meet me. "That's my sister, that's my sister." And the woman's so happy and she'll say, "I really love your sister." So I think there's... I think they're much more good-hearted, open-hearted people. I think a lot of the issue that happens with people with disabilities is fear. where people just don't know and are afraid and stigmatize. And I think probably at the core of that is the fear of this could happen to me. And when you're a family member, you know it could happen to you. You know it could happen to anyone. When I was growing up, I had this image of our block that we lived on when I was a little kid. And it was a suburban block in New Jersey. And I had this image that lightning struck our block around the time I was born. And it happened to hit my house. It didn't hit the other houses. And when it hit my house, it happened to hit my sister's bed and not mine. And therefore, I take care of her. And therefore, our neighbors should help us. And if it had hit their houses, I would feel the same way. And I've just always seen it that way. And I think there are a lot of people, I think everybody recognizes that. It's just a matter of, do you say, lightning could have struck me, therefore I will be open-hearted and giving and kind? Or do you say, lightning could have struck me, and therefore I don't want to know about it? And I guess it's a matter of your relationship with your own conscience.
You've explored a lot of other themes too. You've explored themes of spirituality, which I found really incredible in that you actually went into the minds of these characters and in great detail constructed the way that they saw or perhaps conceived of a god or a greater power through art, you know, as sort of the symbol. And particularly with Homan, where there's an entire sequence where he actually, you know, creates this idea that, you know, maybe humans are sort of, it's like they're a fly on the page, you know, and all they're seeing are little stripes of color, but when they actually, when the fly actually sort of flies up, sees that it's a bigger picture right before it gets swatted. And I thought that was a brilliant image. How did you come up with that?
I think first there's a general bias I have. I was just talking about this last night with a friend of mine who lives in Toronto, who I haven't seen since I was 16, who's come here to be a missionary. And we were talking about the spiritual force in all of us. And I'm Jewish, but I call myself an ambivalist because I haven't made up my mind. And she's Christian. And one of the things that I think we both really strongly agree on is that everybody has spiritual feelings, and everybody is trying to understand it in some way. And I think there's this gross misunderstanding that people with disabilities don't have those thoughts and don't have those feelings and longings and questions, even though they may express them in ways that are in keeping with the way their minds and bodies work, that might be a little different from yours and mine. And so I've talked with my sister about her feelings about God and prayer and religion, and I've talked with her boyfriend. And her boyfriend's told me a few times, I wrote about this a little bit in Riding the Bus, that he's had visions of Jesus. And so it led me to start talking to other people with disabilities about their spiritual experiences and to read a lot about it. And in fact, it's what led to the epigraph of my book. As I was going through reading about it, I came across the work of Reverend Nancy Lane, who runs a ministry for people who have disabilities who haven't necessarily been embraced by their faith traditions. And there's a long history of people feeling alienated from their churches in some way, or being told, oh, this happened because your parents sinned or whatever, and not feeling embraced, or being a wheelchair user and you get to the church and you can't get up the stairs and they haven't made it accessible and you don't feel embraced, or you're told to leave the service because they're not liking how you look or behave or whatever. So anyway, Reverend Nancy Lane has written a lot about this, and in her writings, she had this one line, and I thought, this is the perfect epigraph for the book. Telling our stories is holy work. And I thought, yeah, that's true. And part of the holiness of it, and I say this as an ambivalist, is what are people trying to understand about the larger thing that we're all a part of? And the character of Beautiful Girl takes a very different spiritual approach than the character of Homan. He comes up with this whole conception. And how did I come up with that conception for him? I think part of it was he's in love with Beautiful Girl, and Beautiful Girl is an artist. And so in his conception of the world, part of that would come from seeing her artwork and trying to then make sense of the meaning of it all would come from that. In her case, she was born in a tradition that then was dropped when she went into the institution, and so she's pretty much left to her own devices. There are two other main characters who don't have disabilities, and they also each have a spiritual path involving, in their own way, disabilities. One is very Catholic, and one is a disaffected Protestant. The one who's very Catholic, that's part of why she is so committed to people with disabilities. And the one who's a disaffected Protestant, it's because she had a child with a disability who died, and her husband just said that, God, if God can do this, I don't want a part of it. And this happens to people. So I really wanted to cover not the gamut, but as much as I could about the relationship of disability and spirituality, which it's not only that I've seen it in other people, goodness knows, it's been a part of my life all my life.
From my own experience, I have my youngest brother has an intellectual disability.
How about that?
Yeah, and so I grew up with him, and just generally, watching him, grow into his life. And one of the things that I've found that's really interesting now, seeing him when I go home and visit, is that he has a life, he's totally independent. He has a job, he has a social life, he has, girlfriends sometimes. He has him and his buddies go out and they have a couple of beers on the weekend. They sing karaoke. They're hardcore karaoke fanatics. They do all kinds of things together. And the interesting thing I think that I've learned, and I think this is it's not just hinted at in your book. It's kind of a statement in the work, a lot of the work that you've done with your speaking and with this book, as well as
riding the bus.
Riding the bus with my sister, is that maybe there's something that we can learn about simplifying our lives a little bit, and not taking things for granted for one thing, but also appreciating what we have. Now, from what you've observed in your own life, say observing your sister and her relationship, and her just growing up,
right?
Is there anything now that you take to heart, maybe a lesson that you take to heart that you have learned from her?
Yeah, I've learned that everyone has a right to live a life of their own choosing, and that they design for themselves, and that we have a long history of trying to control people with disabilities and infantilizing them, and it's no fairer to do that with them than it would be for someone to do that with you and me. But what I was thinking of answering was something along a slightly different line, which is I think we're very wrong-headed in our society with what our society values. And so often what our society values is highly materialistic and highly superficial and very opinionated, and placing people in a hierarchical scheme where you can always look down on someone and make yourself feel better. And when, as you know, when you know a person with disabilities very closely, just for that person to be able to brush their teeth is such a great thing. And for that person to make a friend is such a great thing, and keep the friend, and to be able to live in their own apartment. These are just wonderful milestones. So I think it gives you a parallel system of measurement of life, and you can step away from that other one that is so false and be on one that is so much more true, and just fully appreciate. I don't even want to say the little joys. They're not the little joys. They're the big joys that make up a daily life that most people just aren't paying attention to. I mean, I have to say, sitting here across the table from someone who just revealed to me that he's a fellow sibling, that's a joyful thing for me. That's a wonderful thing for me.
Well, it was something that I thought about throughout the book, and for me, that's what that last question was really about. I mean, for me, it's always been an interesting thing to see, because you must know just as well as I do that you have doubts when you first realize, okay, in my case, my brother was different. I knew it, you know,
Right,
and
right.
it took him longer to learn things, and he couldn't grasp certain things. But on the other hand, you know, he was extremely friendly. He's popular. You know, he found ways to get past all of the bullying and things like that happened early on, and he emerged into you know, a pretty responsible independent adult. And that for me is a very interesting thing. And I love the fact that you've taken that idea, but you've created a wonderful work of fiction that anybody can relate to, based on two characters with intellectual disabilities.
I'm sure you, like me, when you were growing up, it's like Flowers for Algernon and, you know, Of Mice and Men and, you know, everything where there was a character. Well, I know. And then, of course, we had our opinions about them. But every time you would come across a character with a disability, just going, oh, you know, this is my life. And finally, when I read The Good Earth, I felt like Pearl Buck really got it. And I recently reread The Good Earth, and gosh, I loved it even more.
I've never read it. I have to admit.
Run home, leave work, run home now, get it, read it. It's so fabulous. Although the character in that book who has an intellectual disability is my sister is in a different place than that character is. But Pearl Buck was a parent of a child with a disability who she did put in an institution. And when I was reading that, I was, I think, 16 or 17. And I thought, this is the first time I felt that there was truth being spoken. And it wasn't only the truth of how the individual is portrayed, it was the truth of the depth of love and sense of responsibility that the main character, the father, feels toward his daughter, which I just wasn't seeing. I don't want to put down John Steinbeck, but it didn't ring true for me. And Faulkner, it didn't ring true for me. But all my life I kept wanting to write about it. And then, of course, I wrote Riding the Bus, and people reacted, so favorably, and it just seemed like maybe the time is right, for, we've had ADA for a long time, and we've had, I'm talking about in America, and we've had federal mandates for special ed, and people are out in the community, and maybe it's time to move into, in a literary form, the truth about what their lives are really like and what a relationship is really like.
I'd just like to ask you a little bit about the story behind the character of Homan.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Now, that was based on a book that you found?
Yeah. So I do all this public speaking for Riding the Bus with my sister, and it was at the end of a talk in Illinois. I had about 10 minutes before my ride was going to come to take me to the airport, and I thought, well, I'll browse the vendor tables. And this, you don't expect something so minute in a life is going to be so profound. And I came across, of course I went to the books, and came across a book that just jumped out at me. And part of what jumped out at me was the title, God Knows His Name, The True Story of John Doe Number 24. And part of what jumped out at me was the cover, which had a photograph of an African-American teenager who looked frightened. And of course my sister's boyfriend's African-American, so I thought, what is this? What is this? And I flipped it over, and on the back I read, in 1945, an African-American teenager who was deaf was found wandering the streets in Illinois. The authorities found him. They realized he was deaf. They didn't understand his signs. Rather than try to find who he belonged to or bring him to a nearby school for the deaf, a judge labeled him feeble-minded and threw him in an institution for people like my sister. And there he stayed for 50 years till he died. And when he died, amazingly, the New York Times found out about it and wrote an obituary about how no one ever knew who he was. And he died a John Doe. And the obituary, when it came out, Mary Chapin Carpenter saw it and was so moved by it, she wrote a song called John Doe Number 24, which is a very beautiful song, which I had never heard. And this reporter named Dave Bakke heard it and said, oh, I must know what I can about this man. I must find out what I can. And he went to the places that this man had lived in and interviewed who he could and constructed this man's life as best he could. And that was the book that I was holding in my hands. So I bought it and ran home and, read it on the plane and bawled my eyes out. And I was just so incredibly moved by the plight of this poor man. who nobody could understand, and he couldn't be understood. And why did that happen? And what did it have to do with him being African American? And was there some kind of a connection there? And one of the things he goes into in the book is the possibility that this man came from the South, where in that era, if he were able to go to deaf school at all, and he might have lived in a state where it didn't happen, it was going to be a segregated deaf school, because deaf schools in the South were segregated, black and white, and he might not have had any kind of real education. But of course he might not have even gotten to school anyway, and so he may never have learned to read and write, and he wouldn't have learned ASL, and therefore nobody would be able to communicate with him. And I was so devastated by this man. He started living inside me. And when I sat down to start writing the book, I was actually not planning to write this book. I was not planning to write any book. I was actually at a moment in my life where I'd had a job I'd loved for many years, and they restructured the department and restructured me out, and I was in a state of grief. So I was kind of desperate myself, and not so much desperate for another job, because I thought maybe I should give the working world a break for right now while I recover from this, but I was desperate with sorrow and emptiness and pain. And I hate to say that, but it's true. I wasn't going to have my students with me anymore. I loved them. I don't have children, and it's not that my students are my children, but they were a way that I could be influencing generations and nurturing people. And I contacted a friend and I said, I just need to start writing again, and can I just be giving you something every week? And she said, sure. So I wrote a short story the first week. She said, this is great, do something for next week. So the following week I sat down and I thought, well, all right, let's do something a little better. And put my pen down on the page. I mean, I put my pen down on the page. And I suddenly started transcribing the opening of the book, and it was like it was being delivered to me. And there's, the widowed, retired school teacher who's in a state of grief, Martha, and it's a dark and stormy night, and a knock comes to her door, and she opens the door, and I thought, who's at the door? And then I thought, oh, it's someone like my sister, and it's John Doe number 24, and I flipped the numbers, and John Doe number 42, and they're secretly hiding a baby, and I just saw the rest of the book. It was this miracle that just came into my mind and my life, and I have said from the beginning, I don't feel I wrote this. I feel like it was delivered to me, and then a piece of this story comes a year and a half later when I didn't talk about the book as I was writing it, but I did contact a friend who has cerebral palsy and uses a wheelchair, and said to her, can I meet with you to discuss a few key scenes in this book that you don't know anything about, and you don't even know I'm writing, and talk me through some details that a wheelchair user would know and that I would not know. And she said yes. So we spent 5 hours sitting in her bedroom this one day, and I read her the first chapter, and then I described what happened to get to the scene that I needed help with, and I talked with her about John Doe number 24. And we get to the end of our 5 hours, and they were very emotional, because it's a very emotional story. And at the end of the 5 hours, I said, she said, I really think this book is going to really make a difference for people. And I said, it just really feels like it came out of nowhere. And she said, I know where it came from. And she has told me that she's had psychic experiences. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, it came from John Doe number 24. And I said, what makes you say that? And she said, he's sitting here. He's on the bed. I can see him now. And I looked. I did not see him. So I don't know. But I said, wouldn't that be wonderful if I helped give him the life he would have wanted? I was very caught up in the story emotionally, and I loved these characters, and I felt like I loved them so much I didn't want the world to know about them until I had the story just right, until I'd done everything I could for them, and then handed it over to to Grand Central. So that's, did I do well by him? I hope I did well by him.
Well, what you did was you wrote what is actually quite an uplifting and happy story.
Yeah, it's
based
funny,
on
isn't it?
just some ghastly truths about history, and you've turned it around and made it into a very uplifting and very inspirational and happy story. It is a very happy story.
I'm so glad you said that, because one of the things that's been hard is to say to people, well, it's about this, but I haven't felt at liberty to say, but really, it actually... I just hope readers, I hope they take these people into their heart. And to me, they're completely real people. And I think if people take them into their heart, I just feel like everybody is going to be, I don't know, feel a beauty with the big drawing, and appreciate that big drawing all the more.